The following conversation is with the master guitar builder, Stephen Walter. In 2022, I asked Steve if I could visit his shop and ask him some questions about his life of building guitars and the journey along the way. I think we had a really fantastic conversation, and I learned so much about this magical art of guitar making. Although I didn't film a proper introduction or conclusion, I hope this will suffice. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoy. Something that people don't really realize about you right away is that you were a player before you were a luthier, and you went and completed a doctorate, a prize at GFA, and a number of other competitions. What drew you to the guitar before even being a luthier?
Well, I of course loved music, and when I was a teenager and a preteen, I actually was a drummer in a rock and roll band, and I was pretty good. But and I was in a band with a bunch of guys who were a couple of years older than I. And when they graduated high school, I was kind of left with nothing really to do. And also realizing at this point, playing drums, you really need to have somebody else around. I mean, you need to have your band to have the whole musical experience. So I started to play guitar. I played some acoustic guitar and electric guitar. And Segovia came to town. So one of the nice things about living in the Chicago area was that he used to come almost every year or every 2 years. And so I got to see him twice as a teenager. Wow. And it was just so cool to hear him play to an audience of 3,000 in Orchestra Hall in Chicago. And to hear the silence is just palpable. Wow. And to hear that sound of the guitar was just so beautiful. But then, making the decision going towards classical guitar, the classical guitar thing seemed to be so uniquely contained, You could do it all by yourself. You didn't need to rely on other people who may have had a different level of commitment that you had.
Yeah.
And so it was fun it was a natural sort of progression.
Wow. And so how long did you study the classical guitar before you went and you did an undergraduate in guitar performance?
Yes, I did. Right? I started the classical guitar about when I was 16, maybe a little, just before I was 16. And took lessons with a local guy here in the Chicago area who was also a flamenco guitarist. And I actually came into his, into his studio and said, I wanted to learn how to play flamenco guitar. Oh, sure. And he said, okay, that's fine, but you have to learn how to play classical first. I thought, well, how long could that take?
Only a few minutes.
Only a few minutes. Yeah, I'll get through that in a couple months, and then we'll start doing the cool flamenco runs, right? Of course, I never got there. So, although I did, when we moved back to this area, I looked him up again, and he's still around. And I called him up and said, "Hey, you remember me?" And I said, well, "I can play classical guitar."
Yeah, you finally can. Yeah, and you took some flamenco lessons.
Yeah, and I did take some flamenco lessons from him too. And realized that it's like it's such a huge change in particularly right-hand technique. It just became a little bit frustrating. So, I put it on hold for now, and probably when I get to a place where I can do more practice without bothering other people, I'll start whacking on that again. But
Well, how long was it in your guitar studies that you started even having an idea that you wanted to try building guitars?
Well, right away from the beginning, I had to build my own classical guitar. My parents are wonderful, people, and when I tell the story, they sound a little ogreish.
Sure.
But I had gone through drums, spent a lot of money on drum sets. I had stints at a number of different instruments, some of which only lasted a couple of months. And so when I came to my parents and said, I really want to learn how to play classical guitar now, and I need a classical guitar, they said, no, too many instruments.
Sure.
At the same time, my best friend at the time, who coincidentally lived right across the street from where we are right now.
Wow. Yeah.
He was also, his father was an amateur cabinet maker, and he was also considering making his own classical guitar. He was the electric guitar player in our
Sure.
band. And we went to the library, and they had Irving Sloane's book on classical guitar construction. And we checked it out and used that as a guide. And my friend's work was beautiful.
Wow.
But he never finished. He barely got past making the back.
Sure.
And perhaps the soundboard.
Because he had so much experience in cabinet making.
Yeah, and his father to help, and so those tools were really amazing. He did beautiful work, and that was just his character too. He's the kind of guy, he was all in. But
Wait, so what age was that?
Oh, so he was 2 years older.
16,
yeah, so
17.
I was maybe 15, a little over 15. He was just preparing to go off to college.
Wow. Okay.
But I finished my guitar, and I call it Picasso's guitar because it's asymmetrical, and
Right.
but it played,
Right.
it worked, and it worked well enough for me to learn how to play. And then while I was learning how to play, I started building the next one, and to get a little bit better. And then when I finished the second one, I sold the first one for enough money to buy the wood for the third one.
Oh.
And
Wow.
sort of did that until I got into the master's program at Boston Conservatory.
Wow. Okay, and then so what happens there? You said until.
Well, yeah, I built a number of guitars. I think I built my first 13 or 14 guitars, through high school and college in the summers. And in truth, none of them were really very good, because I had no idea what a really great guitar was supposed to sound like, was supposed to play like. I'd never held one in my hands.
Sure.
It was one of those
But
things.
you must have been hearing about them like in the guitar building books that you were reading. And...
Yeah, you do, but it's one of those things where you hear names. You heard Ramirez, of course, was the biggest thing in the Chicago area, because this was where the Sherry Brenner, the big importer of Ramirez guitars, were. This is one of the reasons that Segovia always came to Chicago, is because he would go through the inventory of Ramirez guitars here, which was bigger than what they had at the factory at the time.
Wow.
And look for see if there was an instrument that he liked better.
Wow.
So he was there quite a bit, right?
So it was once you arrived at Boston Conservatory that you started noticing all of these amazing instruments and learning what...
Not so much because, there were only a few players there. I did get to see some other instruments. My teacher at that time was Robert Guthrie, who was at Boston Conservatory and Yale University for a year, during a weird sort of break from Southern Methodist University in Dallas, where he taught for decades. Right. And Bob said, I remember, clearly being in a lesson, and him, giving the serious look that he had, and saying, it's really a special thing that you build the guitars, that you play, but you need a better guitar.
Sure.
He was trying to be diplomatic.
Breaks your heart, though, right? Yeah.
No, this is what I knew all along,
right.
Hearing some of my colleagues play at that time. And,
right.
But that gave me the ammunition to go to my parents and say, I need a guitar.
Yeah, sure.
And they figured, well, he's got his bachelor's degree, and he's halfway through his master's degree. I think he might be serious about this. So they, helped me to buy my first, real concert instrument, which was built by Robert Ruck. And it was a 1978 Spruce guitar, and it was okay. It was not one of the great Rucks. Bob Ruck built some amazing instruments, but his consistency wasn't always, what we would hope, to have as builders. But while I was there, I also encountered a friend that played a 79 Cedar Ruck.
Oh, okay.
That was just an amazing guitar. And several years later, I'd heard through the grapevine that he was selling that guitar. And I immediately, called him up, and he lived in Maine at the time, and I was living in Boston, and said, I'll be there this weekend.
Wow.
It was that great an instrument. And that was the instrument where years later, I was looking with an inspection mirror on the inside, and I saw handwriting. I thought, what's this handwriting? And I looked, and you have to read it backwards, and it's in cursive, so it took a little while. But all of a sudden, I saw, constructed for Leo Brouwer, 1979. I was like,
wow,
oh my gosh! And that might very well have been the guitar that he used to write the Cameron Negro with, which is what he was writing at that same time.
That's
and it was a beast of an instrument.
Wow.
I mean, it was, but in a way, it ended up coloring my playing in a damaging way, because it liked to be played hard.
Sure.
Like, it sounded so good when you really pressed into it.
Yeah, interesting.
That, I tended to play everything really loud then, and I didn't, ever back up and listen to the subtleties, because it just didn't respond as well at that point.
Sure. And now, at that time, had you completely stopped guitar building since you'd moved away from where you had the supplies?
Yes, and also, at my parents' basement, I was building instruments with very few real tools.
Sure.
For building guitars, and the guitars showed it. Truthfully, I mean, they were they were pretty crude.
Wow.
And there wasn't the information now that people are able to look online. There weren't luthier shops where you could get a whole bunch of tools, and tools are expensive.
Right.
So,
yeah, and so at that, it's when you began at Boston Conservatory that you took a break from guitar building, basically.
Yes,
right?
absolutely. Yeah.
But at the back of your mind, were you like, oh, I wish I had these tools? You could.
No, it's funny. I didn't, because to me, building the guitar was always a means to an end, and the end was playing the instrument.
Right, because you started that way of like, I need a guitar.
Right. I always loved building them, but again, they didn't look great and they didn't sound that great.
Right.
So it was, it was always a little bit of a compromise.
Sure.
But yeah, when I had the Ruck, I finally thought, well, this is it. I don't have to, do that anymore.
Building guitars.
And it wasn't really until several years later that another friend and I took our guitars to Frank Hasselbacher, I think is his name. But he was the builder of Augustine guitars for Rose Augustine, that particular brand. And we were taking our guitars to him for fretwork. And I got it back, and it's like, this is not any better than it really was before. And so I started to, I picked up some more tools, and I refretted the instrument. Yeah, I took Frank's frets out and put my own in. It was a disaster. Buzzed all over the place. I learned a little more, and then did it again, and ended up with something that really worked well.
That's pretty cool. So then did you start doing work like that for other people in the studio, or?
Not there, and this was after I was done with the master's degree.
Okay.
So this was, this was a little bit later. It wasn't until I started at Florida State. That's really where my guitar building career kind of took off, and playing career.
Sure.
As a, weird chance occurrence, I had a new guitar teacher every year from my freshman year of undergraduate to the completion of my master's.
Wow. 6 years, maybe.
Yeah, it was a 6 years, 6 teachers. And then I went to Bruce. And so Bruce is like really my main teacher, Bruce Holzman, and taught me, how I remember at my auditions, he asked me, after making me play like everything I knew for an hour and a half, he said, why do you want to come here? And I just looked at him and said, because when I sit down to play guitar, I have absolutely no idea what's going to happen.
Right.
I could play great, I could play horrible, and I don't know why.
Right. Well,
and you're the guy that can fix it.
Yeah. I'm sure he liked that too.
Yeah, so, I think he did. So I ended up there. And so all of a sudden I'm in a studio where, there were like, at that time, 50 guitar majors.
Wow.
At Florida State. And not all of them were super serious, but most were.
Yeah, so a lot had amazing guitars.
Yeah, and so there were all these great guitarists that I'd, heard of. Of course, there were a lot of Humphrey guitars because of Bruce's relationship with Tom Humphrey.
Sure.
They were really good friends. There were a few Rucks, a few, other interesting instruments from different builders from all over the world.
Right.
And I finally got to start to see what made a great guitar. What was, what they felt like, what they sounded like, what they smelled like.
Yeah. What guitar was Bruce playing around that time?
Bruce was playing only Humphreys.
Only Humphreys, right?
Yeah, that's all. I think he only had one guitar at that time, which was his Humphrey.
Wow. And then so Florida State came along, and were you thinking once you started Florida State, like, well, I'm going to try these guitars and maybe do some more building on the side?
Not at first. Really, again, it was, there was nobody there who could repair and do this sort of fretwork and whatever adjustment work that needs to be done on instruments now and then. So I started doing that, and I started, examining some of the insides of the guitars and see what was going on, and learning a lot more about, you know, what this guitar is really easy to play. What's making this guitar easy to play?
Sure.
You know, and having that reference from the player's perspective is just so valuable.
Yeah, right.
So,
because you were training to be a better player all the time and like practicing a whole lot. And,
exactly.
yeah. And you were able to like hand your guitars around to people and get their ideas on it.
Oh
too,
yeah,
right?
one of the most valuable experiences when I started building in Tallahassee at Florida State was that when I'd finish guitar, you know, Bruce would come over and, you know, we'd make dinner or something and
Yeah.
sit around and, you know, have a glass of wine, and he'd play the guitar and he'd tell me what he think,
Yeah.
what he thought about it, which, you know, was often good, and
Right.
sometimes, you know, stuff needed a little bit of correction, and he had this way too of like, if something wasn't quite right, he would kind of like play it over and over again
To
and
show you?
give me a look.
Yeah.
And, you know, didn't really have
Oh.
to say much, but, you know, I could hear it.
But that's great because you're sort of around someone that could give you like direct, real feedback. Like
Yeah.
someone who's your teacher is going to be able to like say real things to you. Not
Absolutely. Yeah, and his candor was, you know, has always been remarkable,
Sure.
and that was really refreshing. It was good to be able to do that. It's not always good for people to say, "Wow, that sounds great." You
Right,
know,
right.
It might be good for your ego, but it's not going to be good for your
Yeah,
instruments.
so you have to constantly you've changed so much of your guitars over time, and it's from those little changes or little bits of
Yeah.
honesty, I guess, that
Oh, sure.
come out too,
Yeah,
or
your
things you
own
notice
work.
and learn.
Yeah, and that's again another advantage of being a player myself, is that I really can, you know, I know exactly what I want to hear.
Right.
And it wasn't until really my playing got really good too that I knew that, you know, that's what I want to hear. Oddly enough, it transferred to cello making as well, because my son, who's now 20, started playing cello when he was maybe 12 or 13.
Sure.
And, you know, at that point I even started, you know, thinking about getting him a better cello.
Right.
You know, it's like, I'll be damned if I'm going to spend that much money
Yeah.
on a wooden musical instrument.
Yeah.
So I started thinking about building them and collecting materials. And of course, I probably spent that much money on just the specialty tools you need for cello making,
Sure.
which are phenomenally expensive.
Wow.
And the materials and woods and so forth. But when we moved here, he started taking lessons with a local cellist named Andrew Snow, who had like a 1699 Ruggiero cello. This, you know, if Stradivari was the number 1 builder and Guarneri was the number 2 builder, like Ruggieri was the number 3 builder in Cremona at this time. So it was, you know, it was cool to hear that. Since my son was too young to drive, I'd take him over and sit in the lesson and listen and
start thinking of like what you need to do to make something that would sound more like that.
Yeah, well, it's knowing what it's supposed to sound like.
Right.
Is so much of the battle. And, you know, already being used to working with wood and making sounds with wood, I think made it easier for me to target that. And my first cello I don't think it had any business sounding as good as it
As
did.
it turned out, wow.
Yeah, and the second one was even better. So,
Wow.
I mean, I look forward to trying
Making
that every
more.
now and then. Yeah, when, you know, in all my time. But now I'm getting so much pressure from guitar players to have, you know, put instruments out.
My fault.
Yes, in good part.
No.
Yeah, so...
No, me personally asking for guitars. That's what I mean.
Yeah, that's true too.
You've talked a little bit about the sound that you're sort of going for. You know what you want. What kind of characters do you want in a guitar that you build?
Wow, you know, it's talking about sound is so hard. You know, as you know, and we've tried to you know, talk about it on numerous occasions, and some people like to use some words and to describe sound because, you know, we're borrowing language from our other senses.
Right.
You know, from vision, from
Yeah.
even from
Even
you know,
taste.
texture and taste.
Yeah,
Exactly, right.
creamy or
Right, or you know how mouthfeel.
right, bitter.
Oh, we should start using umami.
That's right.
That guitar has umami.
Yeah.
But at any rate, you know, yeah, it's a hard one. So, without going into the nitty gritty of like the particular characteristic of maybe a string or something, the guitar has to make me want to play more. That's the thing. When I play something, I have to think, oh, that's really tasty.
Right.
You know,
right.
I wonder what else it can do if I do this, or if I do
Yeah.
that, or if I like move a little closer to the bridge, or over this, you know, or more over the sound hole, or
Right.
or how the, you know, the treble strings sound up high or down low, or the basses, you know, can I make them growl? Can I have that kind
Right.
of characteristic? And then on top of that, it's a weird thing, but we want the sounds to blend when like we play a chord, but we also want them to separate because we want to be able to hear the constituents of the chord.
Right.
You know, and if we're playing something contrapuntal, we want to be able to clearly hear those lines.
Right.
So I want to have a guitar also that my ideal guitar in that sense is a guitar that will just, if I just think it musically, it happens on the instrument.
Sure.
You know, I don't want to have to struggle to make those things happen. I don't want to have to have my hands struggle to make one voice pop out.
That's interesting because it's almost, like you say, like there's some things that surprise you almost that make you want to play more.
Yeah.
But at the same time, you don't want all surprises. You want it to be predictable in a beautiful way.
And consistent.
Right?
Yeah,
right.
Of course, it has to do the same thing. Yeah, I think, you know, more because I finished the number 300 guitar fairly recently, and I've had a little chance to play that. You know, mostly when I make guitars, they sit in the shop. You know, the finish has got to be cured, and make sure that there are no errant buzzes, that the frets are level, that the nut isn't pinching, that all of these sort of like practical things. Is the action right for the player?
Right.
And then it goes in a case and into a box, and it leaves.
Right. That's sad.
Yeah.
Bye-bye, yeah. And sometimes you don't even get to hear another player play it for you, right? Yeah.
Yeah, particularly in the pandemic. I mean, usually,
right.
At times, I would have, in the past, I would have Nanai come, because she's in the Chicago area, if she was around and were available.
You would bring it to festivals, too.
Yeah, bring them to festivals. Casey Ellis is also a guitar player who's
nearby.
really good in town, who's nearby, who I could call on to say, hey, I really want to hear this guitar. Would you mind coming by and playing it?
Yeah.
They're usually happy to do so, which is,
Yeah, of course.
which is fun for me. And yeah, but other than that, I mean, I just don't get a lot of chance to see how it develops over weeks or months.
Right.
So this is the nice part about at least the plan of keeping number 300 at
For a
least
little
through the
while.
summer, is that I'm hearing some of those things happen. And I was
Right.
teaching a lesson on Zoom the other day, and like I played an example of something, and it like shocked me. It sounded so nice that I played it a few more times, and I had to remember to like.
You have a student there.
Yeah. Go back to the lesson. Right?
Yeah.
I apologized, and so that's really cool to have that happen.
Yeah,
And,
that's great.
And
well,
then,
you get to hear different types of players playing your instruments too if you hold on to one for longer too, right?
Yeah, absolutely, and and it's funny that not all players will sound really good on one guitar. That's a thing to learn at a place like GFA when you have so many different players come through over and over again. And one of the reasons that I like to bring two guitars at least to one of those that have different characteristics like Spruce or a Cedar,
right,
is that you get to see how people sound better on one than the other. I mean, some people will come and play them and say, "Oh, the Cedar guitar is clearly the best guitar,"
right,
and they'll make that sound that way, and I'll agree with them for them playing. Then the next person will come by and play them, and the Spruce guitar sounds better.
Yeah,
and because we all make different sounds, and
right, or used to like different amounts of pressure for attacks,
absolutely,
or more naily sound, or different ways of shaping the nails.
Yeah, and the guitars respond. I mean, they sound, each guitar has its own characteristic.
Yeah. Was there a point in your career, in your guitar building career, that you started thinking like, oh, I should double down on this. I should do this more, or was it always steady?
Oh gosh, it's funny because my training really is in classical music performance.
Right.
In teaching. That was always kind of my main job, and it was one of these perverse things where every time I felt like I was at a crossroads, I would get opportunities in both fields at the same time. And
you could only pick one?
Well, no, it was something that I could do both, but it ended up being busier and busier.
Sure.
So typically at that time, my schedule, like back when I was teaching, I taught at Furman University for 18 years. I was in a full-time capacity for most of that time.
Right.
And, not just guitar teaching, but music history and a lot of other different academic classes, which I really enjoyed teaching. But so what would happen is I would spend Monday through Friday at the university, and on Saturday and maybe some of Sunday, I'd be in the shop. And then during the summers, I would be full on in the shop. And at this time, I think I was making 4 guitars at a time.
Wow.
And
that's a lot on top of having a full teaching schedule and kids.
It is. And the kids, of course, that,
gosh.
adds another wrinkle to it. So I think at my busiest time period, I was building 8 guitars, 2 batches in the summers.
Wow.
And then maybe 1 batch throughout the year.
Right.
Including like Christmas breaks, weekends, that kind of stuff.
Wow.
So I was typically getting 10 to 12 guitars done a year.
Wow. When did you really start noticing people gravitating towards your instruments and sort of choosing them to be the instrument that they play? And people that like really know, right? Like players.
Right. Well, I think it first happened when I started choosing to play my own instruments, instead of the Humphrey that I was playing at the time.
Sure.
It was an interesting thing. I thought it was really important because of the sort of dual career path that I had to really kind of keep them separate. And that as a player, and for my own honesty and integrity, as a player, I needed to be playing the best instrument I could get my hands on.
Sure.
Which at that time was this wonderful Humphrey Millennium guitar. It was a Cedar.
Right.
Beautiful instrument to play. And I recorded my CD with that instrument.
Sure. Oh yeah. Okay.
And it wasn't until I think it was around, it was my guitar number 94,
94.
which was the instrument, and I think which probably puts it at maybe 2003, 2004.
Sure. You started turning a page there with your instruments.
Yeah, where I was, I remember the piece too, that I was preparing Albanese Cordoba for concerts, and which sounded lovely on the Humphrey, but there were some things that just, they were hard to tune and hard to make the voices work the way I wanted.
Right.
And I played it on a new guitar that I had just built, and it was actually, much of it was better on the guitar that I had built.
Wow.
I mean, not all of it, but there was a...
It's kind of nice that it just snuck up on you, almost like you just realized, like, oh, actually, this works and sounds better on this. No.
Yeah, it was surprising, actually. It was, I remember being,
Sure.
being a little bit, taken aback by it, and very pleased, of course.
Right.
And that's when I really committed to starting to play my instruments rather than the Humphrey.
Now, was there a specific design change around that time that you started to think made them a little bit better?
Well, with Tom's permission, I started making guitars in the Millennium design,
sure.
so that was a big part of it too.
Okay, yeah.
And here's the thing too, seeing, this is where it was so great to be able to work as little as I did with Tom Humphrey and to see so many of his instruments at Florida State, was I learned some very important lessons that I might not have learned like in school, for guitar, in a guitar building school.
Right. Okay.
And one was that it doesn't matter sometimes what's going on inside the guitar, like what kind of bracing you're going to use. It's often how it's built and who's building it.
Sure.
I remember seeing Humphreys with as many as like 23 braces below the sound hole.
And it still had its characteristic.
It was still characteristic Humphrey. Right. Then I saw one with 4 braces or 5 braces.
Right. Wow.
And they were still the same, and I remember being really totally shocked by that.
Wow.
It was also a great example to see someone who was such a good builder continually innovate.
Right.
And not really sticking with anything. Tom always changed stuff. I mean, his guitars were really, it was a cool example to have, to see that throughout the years.
Sure. Now, wasn't your early working with Tom you repairing other instruments sort of under his supervision or instruments of his, right?
Yeah. Often, there were a lot of his instruments at Florida State because, Bruce was able to usually get instruments maybe a little quicker for some of his students from Tom, and they were really good. The selection wasn't as good then either as it is now, for really great hand-built instruments. But often, I would get a call from Tom, and he would ask me if I would look at so-and-so's instrument and do a repair. And I remember one particularly harrowing experience was him teaching me how to remove a bridge and then re-glue it on one of his guitars. Yeah, it's quite drastic, but completely over the phone.
Right. Yeah, there's no video conferencing to figure that out.
No, it was I was flying solo pretty much. But it was,
man.
it was really quite something. So, he described this 2 ways of doing it. You can do it, the old Spanish way, or you can, do it the way I'll tell you. I said, well, what's the Spanish way? He said, well, you take, a block of wood, like a 2x4 or something like that. That's, maybe 1.5 feet long. And you have, secure the guitar and have someone hold it and put the block of wood on the end of the tie block and get your biggest hammer and just bang, hit it really hard. And if you're lucky, it'll usually come off cleanly.
Oh, man. And you're probably like, no way.
Yeah,
I'm
there's
doing
no
that.
way
Yeah.
I'm doing that. That's right.
Oh my gosh.
As you listen to his guitar crunch up.
Yeah.
But so then, he told me the way to do it with a seam separating tool.
Wow, sure.
Basically a spatula-like thing. So.
Got it.
And it was, and I still remember some of his insights. It's like, well, if you come in this way, on most guitars you have to come in from this direction on the bridge, and then on the side that direction, and it was, it's
Right.
interesting to see. But yeah, so I learned a lot that way.
So you were saying it was around guitar number 94, around there, that you started to choose your own instruments. When did you start noticing other players starting to gravitate towards it too? Was it around that time also?
Yeah, around that time, perhaps a little bit later. I remember, of course, around 2006, 2007, getting a call from David Stearman, which was
Right.
a great honor for me. I mean, this is a guy who I'd written papers about, or a paper about in
Right.
school, and in his, journey of expanding the guitar literature through commissioning mostly, American and really modern sounding composers.
Right.
And so he was teaching a master class in North Carolina and heard one of my guitars play. And this was, I think, shortly after Tom Humphrey's death. And he, of course, was a good friend of Tom's and played his guitars for a number of years. And so he was sort of looking for someone. I think he was heartened as well that someone was sort of carrying Tom's torch with the Millennium design.
Sure.
And so he asked me to make him a guitar, and he wanted me to make him a Cedar guitar. He says, my nails are getting crappy as I'm getting older, and, I think that the Cedar guitar, that, warm sound would be better. And, the way he described it, I thought, really he's describing my Spruce guitars. And so I told him, look, I'm going to make you 2 guitars. I'll make you a Spruce and a Cedar guitar, and you can just send the one that you don't like back.
Right.
And this was I think I sent it to him just a week or two before the financial collapse in 2008.
Oh, right.
And because after playing them for a few weeks, he said, I really love them both, and I'd like to keep them both, and I thought about buying them but really I should probably just be a little prudent and pick one of them. And he chose the Spruce guitar, sent
Right.
the Cedar guitar back, and a few months after that, I brought the Cedar guitar down to Florida State and showed it to Bruce, and
This is where our stories link up, actually, is because this was the first guitar that I tried of yours, because my teacher at the time was Sylvia, who ended up buying
Sylvia
guitar,
Choulier bought that guitar.
Yeah.
And and it was wonderful, and that was the instrument that he had all of his great competition successes with.
That's right.
And,
Yeah. Yeah, and I remember my experience, seeing that guitar. I had like a just above maybe like the factory level type of guitar, and then I heard that guitar. And also, I was going to all the studio classes around that time and hearing all the different players play, and that guitar stuck out to me, and that became in my mind like, I have to get that one, that guitar at some time. But at the time, I definitely could not afford it. But a few years later, I ended up commissioning guitar from you, and that was like 2013.
Yeah, and there were a ton of my instruments in Bruce's studio at that time.
Yeah, that's really interesting. It was like at that point, I remember during my undergraduate, there's sometimes like 12, 13 of your guitar. Maybe that's an exaggeration. It just felt like that. But at least in that area, in between Columbus and Florida State, there was a lot of your instruments around.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, there were. It happens like that sometimes. It's because, again, my experience as a player, that I know, I'm friends with a lot of guitar teachers and a lot of players, because we went to school together, we had all of these experiences, and so that when I say, call them up and say, hey, I've got a new guitar, you want to see it? It's kind of like, they respond more sometimes as a friend, because
Right.
You know, that is our relationship. Whereas
It's not like a sales pitch, like I want you to play this in a concert for me or something, right?
Yeah. So it's not a pressured thing. It gives us a chance to hang out and play guitars, and you know, that's what we all like to do. So
well, and plus it's kind of been proofed by you. If you want to show it to them, it's like already a guitar that's like you're like, hey, I like this one. You want to check it out? So.
That's right. Yeah.
Oh, that's pretty cool. Awesome.
Yeah. So it's and then after that, everything is just sort of really snowballed, and every time things slow down a little bit, it just seems that then some other opportunity comes up, and
right,
I get another guitar player that's fairly high profile playing my instruments. And
right. And how many instruments do you build nowadays per year?
It's funny because I don't build that many more than I used to. I build maybe 15 or 16 instruments a year.
15 or 16.
Yeah.
And does that feel like you're always having to drive at building, or do you feel like you work at it like a relaxed pace and you're really happy during the whole process?
I think probably both. There are certain times where I feel like I've got a deadline where in my waiting list I build in places for festivals like GFA. I always go to the Columbus State Festival,
right?
With Andrew Zone, and just because there are places where I know I'm going to see a lot of great guitarists. I know I'm going to see a lot of friends.
Yeah, that's great.
It's always a fun event, and so there are a few of these throughout the year that I go to. And so you have to have something to bring. So I'll usually block it into my list that here's going to be one for the Columbus State Festival or the FSU Festival.
Right.
Or GFA if I'm going, or Easerloan if I have the opportunity to go over there.
Right.
And then it's like a hard deadline. It's like I can't. It's like the Redwood guitar that I have now. It's
that one right there.
Yeah, that one right there. I have to leave in a couple days and bring that down to Columbus State and.
But that's got to be a nice break in all of the hustle of guitar building and all that stuff. You see friends, you get your guitars played, and it's just not off in the mail. And you
get to hear them. You get to hear a lot of people play it in different rooms, and that's a really important thing. Especially, the pandemic was difficult because I couldn't get a lot of people to play my guitars because everybody was staying at home and there weren't festivals and so that was. That was a little difficult, but now things are looking up a little bit, and it's nice to get out again.
Yeah.
But in terms of the schedule, it's for the most part, fairly relaxed. It's nicer to take more time to not have to hurry towards the end. Sure.
So now I've had the pleasure of owning, more than 3 of your instruments, but for the most part, number 192. Number 221, and I currently have number 271. Mm-hmm. And each of those guitars have kind of been like a different design that you've slightly changed. And how do you approach the change of design? Like, your guitars are known for being so consistent, but at the same time, I know you make little changes. Like, how do you sort of compartmentalize those changes versus your typical design and wanting to keep this consistency from guitar to guitar?
Right. Good question. Well, first of all, your first guitar had a radically different bracing system than your second guitar.
Yes.
And the third guitar was closer, maybe. Right. I mean, the second guitar and third guitar were
lattice braced.
All lattice. Yeah, we're both lattice braced.
The first one was whisker braced, right?
Right. It was radial braced, right? So radial. 3 fan braces in the middle, and then braces radiating out from the bridge pads. From that location.
And you had been building those for, 100 guitars or something? Or
maybe not quite that many, but I remember I built one of the first, I think Sylvia's guitar was the first one of those that I built.
Oh, wow, okay.
Actually, yeah. Yeah, I think, and then I went from that to the full-faced bracing pattern, which was more like the
221. Yeah.
But the inspiration for the lattice bracing came again from Tom Humphrey. It was so he started using lattice bracing underneath the sound hole. So as a typical kind of like bracing pattern where you have these what we call harmonic bars above and below the sound hole, big beefy bars that are just basically there to for structural support. And then eventually he went to a system where he extended the lattice bracing all the way up to the upper bout of the guitar and all the way up to the top where it joins the neck.
Right.
Sort of as in one continuous thing. So my bracing pattern was a little bit like that, a riff on that design. Because one of my really good friends who's also had a ton of my guitarists in the past. Bob Texera had just gotten a Spruce Humphrey, you know, and I really liked the sound. I liked something about it, and it stuck in my head. And so I kind of redesigned that bracing pattern.
And you looked under there with a mirror. And
right, looked in the mirror and then thought about the way, you know, my lattice bracing is maybe different than some other, the way others do lattice bracing is that I have very, you know, lattice bracing, you have braces that cross over each other. So how you approach the transition of the, you know, one direction and the other direction and how they meet is, you know, there are a lot of choices. So I have basically a set of solid lower or underneath braces, and then the upper braces I use a beefier piece of wood and then carve it down so that they just sort of, and I notch the upper one.
They lay on top of each other now.
Yeah, the uppers lay over the unders without them both sides being notched together.
Ah, I see.
And you know, and then I just sort of like carve them over so that you see little gentle, you know, sort of waves in the brace itself.
Right. Mm-hmm. And not to get into the nitty gritty of like all of those major changes, because I think you've talked about those in other ways, and people can obviously see them in your instruments, but how do you approach it in general about...
Okay, yeah.
You know, about making little changes here and there, like, not what little changes have you made, but why do you do them? How do you...
Okay, yeah, good.
How do you know you're not going to make a terrible guitar and, like, you know...
Okay, yeah, so with little changes, you know, the sort of day-to-day things. One of the reasons that I like to build 2 guitars or 3 guitars at one time is because you can make some subtle changes to one of the instruments and then sort of gauge what happens. I mean, it might not be the only thing going on, so maybe I'll have to do it 2 or 3 times where I make one of them a little bit different in the same way. You know, we look for different things in the sound. If I find something that I want to be a little bit better, whether it be like evenness of the treble string or sustain in the trebles or volume of a certain string or a certain range, then, you know, we can think of what's happening inside the box and decide I want a little stiffness in some area, so I might add some braces or maybe not carve them down as much. Or I want more looseness, or asymmetry, so I'll remove one of the braces of the lattice, or do little things like that, and then you start to come up with some generalizations about how that system is working.
Wow.
It's always the whole idea of designing the inside of a box of a guitar is that you have got, you know, the force of the strings that are basically trying to rip it apart, and then you have the thickness of the soundboard and the thickness of the other pieces of wood and the bracing that helps keep it together as a guitar. And you want that balance to be pretty close. You know, if you overbuild the instrument, it's not going to sound good. If you underbuild the instrument, it either will explode or not last very long. You know, that everything will start to deflect so much that it just no longer has the shape of an instrument and it gets tired.
It seems like almost like a game of tug of war where both sides are equal and everyone's just like leaning back and relaxing. But there's like no way.
Pluck the string.
Exactly.
In between, absolutely.
Yeah. Oh, that's cool.
Yeah, so that's how I approach it.
Yeah.
And there's so many different things that we can do. I mean, I've experimented with different wood species of braces.
That's what I was just going to cut in and say, because I feel like when you are talking about selecting woods, you were showing me woods for a guitar you might be building me coming up. And I'm thinking, you're talking about these little brace changes, but then you're saying, oh, this piece of wood came from here, and I like it because of this, and it's like, you even have the wood to deal with, which is a huge part of it seems like. But in another way, it's not. Like you said, you've seen all sorts of different design changes, or a wood that seems to be bad, or you would not think it's good, still sound good on an instrument because...
Well, maybe not bad, but better and not as good.
Right.
Yeah, and those selections. And, you know, the best thing for most guitar players, and I think, or builders, and I think we would agree, is the benefit of using material from the same tree.
Oh, right.
So I've had, nice opportunities over my career where I've had chances to buy, like, a bunch of wood from the same tree, literally, that, you know, comes in big pieces. I had some what we ended up calling Amazon rosewood. I don't even know, it was sort of like a mystery rosewood that it was maybe 4 feet tall, and a tree that was about this big, and the center was rotted out anyway, but the rest of it was sort of bucked into these quarter sawn sections that were just perfect, and I got maybe 50 guitars out of that.
Wow.
It was a beautiful wood, and I regret not having it anymore. But
Yeah.
the nice thing about it is that, you know, you build your first instrument with that.
Sure.
And then you respond to that and you build another, and then you get this
Right.
real sense of what that wood likes, and if it's the same material,
Right.
it's really quite amazing. Many guitar builders try to build like paired instruments for a duo, for example,
Sure.
which is kind of funny because, you know, again, I think I have a lot of experience with Tom Humphrey, you know, in the Assads. He, I think a couple of times at least, tried to build the Assad brothers matching guitars.
Right.
But the problem is that they don't play the same. They don't
Right.
make the same sound. So the guitars could sound identical
Yeah.
when they start, but after they've been played for a while with one technique and another technique, even the guitars themselves will start and sound different after 6 months or a year. And, you know, not to mention the fact that the players will just sound like different players.
Yeah, and that's oftentimes how duos are. Is like one person brings one thing to the table, and the other
Yeah.
person brings another.
And truthfully, that's my favorite kind of duo to hear. It's
Right.
one of the reasons I love to hear the Assad brothers play is because it's that difference in timbre really makes it sound like an ensemble rather than just like a guitarist with a lot of fingers. And a lot
Yeah,
of
yeah,
strings.
that's right. Yeah.
You know, which is a different kind of thing.
Yeah.
And maybe the that solo duo, another fantastic,
yeah.
amazing duo. You know, they are able to blend their sound a lot better.
That's
They're
right.
such incredible players, and their music making is just, you know, out of this world.
Right.
But
yeah.
you know, that's a different approach. So I guess you can do it both ways.
Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, let's do a lightning round where I ask you, where I just ask you some questions. You have to give me your gut response to
okay.
it. And of course these are like hot topics. Some of them and others not so much. But
Right.
first off, Spruce or Cedar?
Spruce.
Spruce. Okay. And for a one sentence explanation why?
Oh gosh, yeah, that's the hard thing. I think Spruce done right is magic. That's, I guess, if I just have to keep it
That's
short.
awesome. And Cedar done right is?
Ooh, mysterious.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
I like that. Next. Carbon or nylon?
Both.
What do you...
Well, I like, my preferred combination is to use a carbon G and B string and a nylon, heavier nylon E string. So light tension or normal tension carbon strings. The B string in particular, in almost every set, is underpowered. If you look at the tension gauges,
Too long.
Oh.
Okay. Go ahead, yeah. No, but you're saying the G
Oh
and
yeah,
B string.
the B string in particular. If you look at the tension listings on a set of strings, D'Addario again is really good about listing the how much
Right.
tension each string pulls in each set. The B string is always like 15% or more less than any other string. And I think the reason they do that is to make the E string louder in comparison.
I see.
So because thought of as the melody string.
Right.
But to me, it just like really sells that B string short. So the carbon strings are naturally about 25% tighter
Right.
than nylon strings anyway. So having that tighter carbon B string makes a better transition between the G to the E. For
Right.
me.
So 640 or 650, and why would someone choose one or the other?
Oh gosh, I like 650. I think it's it's a nice standard. It's as we go shorter with the strings, it's easier to play, and not just because of stretching. Because really, over the first to fifth frets, between 650 and 640, you're only talking about 2.5 millimeters.
Right.
That's almost an unnoticeable difference, but it reduces the string tension having the shorter strings,
Sure.
which makes it easier to play. But the more you reduce your string tension, the less volume and the character starts to change. So as you get even shorter, some builders build 630 guitars.
Sure.
Or you can even get an idea of what this is like on your guitar if you capo the first fret and tune to A440
Right.
after that, so that your A string with your capoed A string is an A.
Yeah.
You can feel the difference in that way, and
Wow.
in the size as well. I mean, it's something that you can't just keep going shorter.
Right.
660 was probably excessive.
Right.
I think 650 is a good compromise, but 640 is perfectly acceptable.
Was there anything that you had a strong belief on at some point in guitar building, either small or a big fundamental change that you end up changing your mind on? And if so, what was? What made you change your mind is what I want to ask. Yeah.
Probably two things.
Okay.
Well, the first, sound ports. I was really resistant to sound ports. I thought it was, sort of a silly thing. Journal for American Luthiery put out a whole issue on sound ports.
Whoa.
That where they did some really good sort of studies and comparisons. They built a guitar and drilled holes in it all over the place and corked them up and had people play them and removed certain corks and in that. It was clear that at least professional musicians in the audience could hear a positive difference from, the ported versus unported.
Wow.
And then I tried it on, an older guitar of mine. I just got out my drill and,
Right.
put some holes in it.
It's easy to try.
Yeah,
huh?
it is easy to try.
But don't make your own sound ports.
Don't do this, because you'll wind up with one that looks like Florida.
And that's the craziest type of port.
Right, exactly. But and there, and then I tried it, and it was a clear difference. I mean, certainly behind the guitar it sounds better, and in front of the guitar it sounds better too. I mean, almost everybody agrees. Some people don't like them for some reasons that, there's a couple of people that find them harder to tune, and some legitimate reasons, and that's okay. But I think that's one of them.
Sure.
The other is a radius fingerboard.
Oh, right.
And I was reminded, very rudely, I should say, by my old teacher, Bruce Holzman. We were talking about radius fingerboards last time I was down there at Florida State, and how he used to say that, you didn't used to like doing that. What changed your mind? And, of course, it was Bruce's brother, Adam, who wanted me to build the guitar for him with a radius fingerboard and started doing it. And I'm not still entirely convinced it makes it easier to play. Sometimes I find myself playing more accurately, but maybe because I'm thinking more about the placement of my fingers. But, and Bruce did remind me that while I was a doctoral student at Florida State, I did write a paper about why you shouldn't use a radius fingerboard.
That's great.
He was happy to remind me.
Oh, that's funny.
Well, there you have it. I believe shortly after this clip ended, Steve showed me around his workshop and showed me some new guitars, and we strung up one for the first time. So keep an eye out for those videos coming soon on my channel. And I didn't get a chance to thank Steve Walter on camera for showing me around his workshop and for his time. So thank you so much to Steve. If you're interested in checking out his work and his guitars, you can go to StephenWalterGuitars.com or find him on social media anywhere by searching Stephen Walter Guitars. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.